Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know, when we look at old maps, the really ancient ones, there is this expectation of mythology.
Oh, yeah,
You
definitely.
see sea monsters drawn in the margins, and the edges just sort of fade into blank space.
Right, and the cartographer just writes, "Here be dragons," or something like that.
Yeah, a completely blank canvas waiting to be filled in by whoever had the courage to sail out there.
Mm.
But then you look at the cartography of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America in the late 18th century, and that clean narrative is entirely shattered.
It really is. We are looking at a geographic landscape that is, honestly, a battlefield of ink and paper.
Today, we are embarking on an extensive deep dive into the Spanish expeditions to the Pacific Northwest during the Age of Exploration.
It is the absolute definition of cartographic warfare. The lines drawn on those maps were not just representations of coastlines, they were legal arguments.
Yeah, weapons used by empires to shut out their rivals. So for you listening, we're going to uncover a chapter of North American history that has largely been painted over.
And we have some really fascinating source material for this.
Right. The sources we are working from span historical records, academic journals, and detailed encyclopedic entries that chronicle this multi-decade effort by Spain.
A huge effort to map, claim, and defend the Pacific coast, stretching all the way from California up to Alaska.
So our mission today is to unpack not just the timelines and the maps themselves, but the geopolitical chess matches, the espionage, the severe maritime conditions, and the legacy of these voyages that completely reshaped international law.
The sheer audacity of the premise is what warrants such a thorough examination. I mean, we are analyzing an empire attempting to lock down half a continent.
Based on legal documents drafted centuries before anyone had even seen the coastline in question.
Yes, the psychological disconnect between the bureaucrats in Madrid and the sailors freezing in the North Pacific is really a central theme here.
Well, let me stop you right there because I want to make sure we understand the foundation of this. The Pope effectively took a map, drew a line down the middle of the globe, and divided the entire non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal.
Right, this was the 1493 Papal Bull Inter Cetera and the subsequent 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas.
Did Spain really believe a decree from Rome gave them physical ownership of lands that no European had ever laid eyes on?
They absolutely did. To understand this, you have to put yourself in the legal framework of the late 15th and early 16th centuries.
Which was very different from today.
Very. International law, as understood by Catholic Europe, was deeply intertwined with theology. The Pope, acting as the ultimate moral and legal arbiter on earth, granted Spain the exclusive right to navigate, trade, and evangelize in the Western Hemisphere.
So when Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513 and waded into the Pacific Ocean,
He didn't just claim the water he was standing in. He claimed the entire ocean and every single shore it touched for the Spanish crown.
that is just an almost incomprehensible level of arrogance. I mean, he claims an ocean that covers roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface by standing on a beach in Panama.
It is bold, for sure.
So from Spain's perspective, they didn't need to plant colonies every 10 miles along the coast of California or Washington to prove they owned it.
Correct. They operated under the assumption of right of first discovery backed by papal decree. It was a paper empire, but to them, that paper was ironclad.
And that worked for a while, right?
It did. For over 2 centuries, this theoretical ownership was sufficient because the Pacific Ocean was effectively a Spanish lake. It was too remote and too difficult for rival European powers to access regularly.
But the reality of the sea and human ambition eventually challenges the weight of those paper claims. Fast forward to the late 18th century, and the Spanish government starts getting nervous.
Ferris.
According to the sources, they are hearing reports of Russian fur traders setting up outposts in Alaska. At the same time, British ships are beginning to sniff around the Pacific. Why this sudden interest from other empires? What changed?
The catalyst was the fur trade, specifically the maritime fur trade. As global markets expanded, the demand for sea otter pelts in places like Qing Dynasty China skyrocketed.
And these pelts were incredibly valuable.
Extremely. Russian Promyshleniki, these tough frontier fur trappers, had been moving steadily eastward across Siberia.
Right, eventually crossing the Bering Strait.
Yes, and establishing footholds in the Aleutian Islands and mainland Alaska. When word of this lucrative trade and the resulting Russian settlements trickled down to the Spanish authorities in Mexico City and Madrid, it triggered a strategic panic.
Because suddenly, A paper decree from 1493 isn't going to stop a heavily armed Russian trading company.
Precisely. Spain had to pivot abruptly from passive ownership to active defense. They realized they needed physical ships in the water.
Which led to them building a whole new naval base.
Yeah, to facilitate this, they established a specialized naval department at San Blas, located in present-day Nayarit, Mexico.
And this wasn't an easy build.
No, San Blas was carved out of the jungle specifically to serve as a launching pad and supply depot for these northern reconnaissance missions.
Which sets the stage for the voyage of 1774. Spain scrambles a mission. Juan José Pérez Hernández takes command of the frigate Santiago.
Which the records also refer to as the Nueva Galicia.
Right. He set sail from San Blas with a crew of 86 men. The mandate is to reach Alaska, scout out these supposed Russian settlements, and assert Spanish dominance.
But the realities of navigation immediately derail the plan.
Yeah, the Pacific coast of North America is notoriously unforgiving.
You are dealing with the California current pushing south against the ships, prevailing northwesterly winds that make sailing north incredibly difficult, and just persistent, blinding fog.
And the Santiago struggled against these elements.
It did. Furthermore, the provisions they loaded in San Blas began to spoil rapidly in the damp conditions.
So they were starving and lost in the fog.
Basically. Facing a deteriorating situation, Perez was forced to abandon the push to Alaska. He turned back upon reaching the Haida Gwaii archipelago, which lies off the coast of present-day British Columbia.
Even though they failed to reach their target latitude, the geographic and ethnographic data they collected is a major focal point in the sources.
Yes, Perez and his pilot, Francisco Antonio Morel, kept detailed journals. They documented their encounters with the local indigenous populations.
Specifically the Haida people.
Right. They are sketching the coast, noting the currents, and recording observations about local customs, dress, and material culture.
Those journals are invaluable historical documents.
They really provide one of the earliest written accounts of the indigenous cultures of that specific coastal region from a European perspective.
And the Spanish were looking for very specific information, weren't they?
Yeah, they were particularly focused on assessing the military capabilities, trading practices, and political structures of the people they encountered. This intelligence was vital for planning future colonial endeavors.
Let's dig into a detail from those journals, because this is where the conventional narrative fractures.
Oh, this is a fascinating part.
The standard historical line is that Perez and his crew were the first Europeans to ever visit this specific area. But the sources reveal that Perez himself cast doubt on that very idea.
He did. When they encounter the Haida canoes coming out to trade, Morel records a detail that completely contradicts the first contact assumption.
The Haida already possessed iron implements.
The presence of manufactured iron among the Haida in 1774 is a profound historical anomaly.
Because they couldn't make it themselves.
Right. Iron metallurgy did not exist in the indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest prior to European contact. They utilized copper, wood, and bone, but not smelted iron.
Therefore, the iron had to originate from an external source.
It had to.
I find it hard to accept that this iron just drifted ashore on a log. If the Spanish were supposedly the first Europeans there, how do we explain this? And the sources mention a highly specific detail.
About Captain Tachiraquar.
Yes. Morel writes that Perez speculated these iron tools belonged to the men of a Captain Tachiraquar. Who is this?
The reference to Captain Tachiraquar is really intriguing. According to the Spanish speculation recorded by Morel, this unknown captain had supposedly sent a launch ashore in that exact location at some point in the past.
And the men in the launch never returned.
The implication is that the Haida acquired the iron tools from this doomed shore party.
So we have a ghost expedition, a lost ship, or perhaps a stranded crew that predates the official Spanish arrival.
It highlights the absolute porousness of historical records. We rely on official documentation, the logs that survive, the maps that were formally published by state entities to define concepts like first contact or discovery.
But the physical material evidence tells a conflicting story.
Exactly. Well, it suggests a shadow history of undocumented voyages, perhaps rogue traders or shipwrecked sailors who interacted with the coastal populations long before the bureaucrats in Madrid or London began drawing their official lines on the map.
It forces a total re-evaluation of the word discovery. You can't discover a place if the locals come out to greet you holding tools forged by someone who already beat you there.
That's a very fair point.
But regardless of where the iron came from, the 1774 voyage proved one thing to the Spanish crown. Sailing by, Trading a few sea otter pelts and drawing a rough sketch of the coastline was not enough to secure an empire.
The Russians and the British were not going to respect a casual drive-by.
No. Spain needed a much more rigorous, aggressive effort.
That realization boasts the expedition of 1775, which stands as a masterclass in maritime endurance and suffering.
The Spanish Admiralty commanded Lieutenant Bruno de Heceta to lead a heavily reinforced mission.
Heceta commanded the Santiago, the same frigate used the previous year, but he was accompanied by a second-in-command, Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra.
And he captained a tiny schooner called the Sonora. Let's talk about the Sonora, because the dimensions of this ship are difficult to process.
It was very small.
The Santiago is a proper, sizable frigate. The Sonora, which was also known as the Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, is 36 feet long.
To put that in perspective for you listening, 36 feet is roughly the length of a standard school bus.
And it has a crew of 16 men crammed into it. Navigating the treacherous, storm-ridden Gulf of Alaska in a boat that size is not just dangerous, it borders on suicidal.
The strategic logic behind the Sonora was sound, even if the execution was brutal on the crew.
How so?
Well, the Santiago had a deep draft, meaning it could not safely navigate close to the uncharted rocky shorelines. The Sonora, being small and shallow drafted, was designed for close coastal reconnaissance.
Ah, so it would enter the narrow inlets, map the shallow bays, and investigate the estuaries that the larger frigate had to avoid.
Right. The mandate was not just to map the coast, but to reassert Spanish claims by physically landing and conducting formal possession ceremonies.
Early in the voyage, the strategy seems to pay off. Heceta manages to identify the mouth of the Columbia River.
He doesn't sail into it due to the intense currents, but he maps its location, which is a significant geographic prize.
But the expedition quickly descends into a nightmare. In mid-July, they reach the vicinity of Point Grenville, located in present-day Washington state.
The changing tides trapped the Sonora between a reef and the point.
The physical environment really dictated the tragic outcome here.
It did. While Heceta anchored the larger Santiago a safe distance offshore in deeper water, Bodega y Cuadra and the Sonora were highly vulnerable, pinned near the coast.
Initially, a large group of local Quinault people paddled out to the schooner.
And they engaged in what appeared to be peaceful, mutually beneficial trade.
But the situation the next morning is desperate.
Mm-hmm.
Bodega y Cuadra needs fresh water and firewood to keep his crew alive.
So he makes a fateful decision. He sends a shore party of 6 sailors in the schooner's only small boat.
They land on the beach. Suddenly, a large armed party of Quinault warriors emerges from the tree line.
They attack and kill the entire Spanish shore party right there on the sand.
And Bodega y Cuadra watches this happen from the deck of the Sonora. He is trapped. He has no other boat to send for a rescue.
He is stuck on a 36-foot wooden shell, having to fend off approaching canoes using just 2 small swivel guns and a handful of muskets.
The violence of that encounter deeply traumatized the expedition. Heceta subsequently named the location Punta de los Martires, or Point of the Martyrs.
This event shattered any lingering illusions in Madrid that asserting sovereignty over the Pacific Northwest would be a passive administrative task.
Because the indigenous populations were numerous, well-armed, highly organized, and fully capable of defending their territories against European incursions.
Yes, and the violence from the shore was only half the problem. The physical health of the crews was collapsing.
Scurvy was rampant, particularly on the larger Santiago. When we read about scurvy in historical accounts, it is often glossed over as simply a lack of vitamin C.
But the reality of this disease on an 18th century ship is horrifying.
Can you break down what it actually does to the body?
It is a devastating physiological breakdown. Without ascorbic acid, the human body cannot synthesize collagen.
Which is the structural protein that holds tissues together.
Right. So the sailors experienced severe lethargy. Their gums swelled and bled, their teeth fell out, and old wounds that had healed years prior would spontaneously tear open.
That is just gruesome.
Blood vessels weakened, causing internal hemorrhaging. It is a slow, agonizing deterioration of the body's structural integrity.
Because of the rampant disease and the psychological blow of the Point Grenville attack, Heceta makes the executive decision to turn the Santiago around and retreat to San Blas.
He simply does not have enough healthy men to sail the ship.
But Bodega y Cuadra, commanding the tiny, vulnerable Sonora, refuses to quit.
His commanding officer retreats, his crew is sick and terrified, and Bodega looks at the situation and decides to press further north.
Why? Why keep going in the 36-foot boat with a dying crew?
Bodega y Cuadra understood the political mathematics of his orders. returning to San Blas without having reached the northern latitudes, without definitively confirming or denying the presence of Russian settlements.
That would render the entire grueling expedition a failure in the eyes of the viceroy.
Exactly. Well, driven by intense personal ambition and duty to the crown, he pushed the Sonora northward, navigating some of the most dangerous coastal waters on Earth.
Eventually reaching 59 degrees north latitude in the vicinity of Sitka Sound, Alaska. It's like navigating a chaotic highway on a skateboard. The sheer maritime endurance required is hard to wrap your head around.
And along the way, he performs these acts of sovereignty. The sources mention this repeatedly.
Right, what does an act of sovereignty actually entail? How do you legally claim a forest you've never seen before?
It was a highly formalized, theatrical, legal ritual. The Spanish sailors, despite suffering from scurvy and exhaustion, would row ashore.
Wait, they did this even when they were severely ill?
Oh, yeah. They would erect a large wooden cross. The officers would draw their swords, cut branches from the trees, and move stones to physically alter the landscape.
Just moving rocks around to say we're here?
Pretty much, they would chant the Te Deum, a traditional Latin hymn of praise, into the empty woods.
And then there's the bottle.
Yes. Finally, they would bury a glass bottle containing a wax-sealed document detailing the date, the sovereign reigning in Spain, and the names of the explorers.
Thereby claiming the land through the principle of effective symbolic occupation.
Right.
They're essentially planting a flag, burying a time capsule, and assuming that gives them legal title over thousands of miles of coastline.
It seems absurd now, but that was the law of the time.
But here is the fatal flaw in the entire Spanish strategy.
Mm.
Bodega y Cuadra pushes his crew to the brink of death. They map the coastline up to 59 degrees north. They bury their bottles, they return to Mexico.
And then the Spanish government takes all of these hard-won maps, all of this vital intelligence, and locks it in a vault.
They classify it as a state secret.
This decision highlights a fundamental disconnect between Spanish imperial policy and the reality of the 18th century world.
They were holding on to an old way of doing things.
Spain was operating under an outdated paradigm of imperial monopoly, a mindset forged in the 16th century. They believed that by keeping their geographic discoveries strictly classified, they could prevent rival nations from safely navigating those waters.
The logic being, if the British or the Russians didn't have the maps, they couldn't pose a threat.
Right. But keeping the discoveries a secret was meant to protect their claims, and instead it created a huge vulnerability. It completely backfired.
Because the rivals they were trying to blind were about to use Spain's own intelligence against them. We see this exact scenario play out during the next major push north, the 1779 expedition.
The 1779 expedition was commanded by Ignacio de Arteaga on the corvette Favorita.
With Bodega y Cuadra returning, right?
Yes, this time commanding a larger vessel, the Princesa. The geopolitical stakes had escalated by this point.
Their mission parameters were explicitly aggressive. They were to evaluate the Russian penetration in Alaska, search for the fabled Northwest Passage to secure a strategic trade route.
And, most notably, they had standing orders to intercept and capture the famous British explorer, Captain James Cook.
The Spanish intelligence network knew Cook was in the Pacific, and they viewed him as a direct threat to their sovereignty.
So Arteaga and Bodega y Cuadra sail deep into the north. They reach Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet, pushing past 61 degrees north latitude.
They are navigating through freezing rain, dodging icebergs, and fighting severe scurvy once again. And they perform more of their formal possession ceremonies at places like Port Etches.
The ceremony at Port Etches was legally paramount for Madrid. By physically landing and performing the ritual at 61 degrees and 17 minutes north, they firmly established the northernmost boundary of their claim to sovereignty in the North Pacific.
They were meticulously documenting their physical presence to satisfy the requirements of international law,
ensuring they had documented proof to counter any future Russian or British claims.
But let's examine the profound irony of their primary objective, capturing James Cook. They are freezing, dying of scurvy, desperately hunting the British captain through the fjords of Alaska.
But Cook is already dead.
Right. He was killed in Hawaii in February of 1779, months before the Spanish were actively searching for him in the north.
That is the first layer of irony, yes. The vast distances and slow communication of the era meant the Spanish were hunting a ghost.
But the second layer of irony is far more damaging to the Spanish imperial strategy.
The second layer is that Cook wasn't sailing blindly into the Pacific Northwest.
No, he was navigating using smuggled, hand-copied versions of Francisco Antonio Morel's maps from the 1775 Spanish expedition.
Spain locked the maps in a vault, but British spies in Madrid managed to acquire them anyway.
The failure of Spanish operational security was absolute and devastating.
Clandestine agents working for the British government had acquired Morel's journal and maps, translated them, and placed them directly into James Cook's hands before he even departed England on his third voyage.
Spain's insistence on absolute secrecy did not prevent the British from acquiring the geographic data.
It merely prevented Spain from receiving the international credit for gathering it in the first place.
It is complete strategic failure. And to add insult to injury, the sources note a detail from Cook's voyage that is almost comedic in its irony.
About the spoons.
Yes. When Cook arrived at Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island in 1778, a year before the Spanish were looking for him, he traded with the local Nuu-chah-nulth people.
During this exchange, Cook noticed an indigenous person wearing a necklace made of silver spoons.
And those spoons originated from the Spanish frigate Santiago during the 1774 voyage.
Cook meticulously documented the presence of those Spanish spoons in his logbook. He recognized immediately that another European power had preceded him to that specific anchorage.
But because Spain refused to publish their findings, the global public knew nothing of Perez or Bodega y Quadra.
When Cook's journals were published posthumously in 1784, the British public and the mercantile class devoured them.
The publication sparked a frenzy of commercial interest in the Pacific Northwest fur trade.
The secret was entirely out, and Britain, not Spain, was controlling the narrative and reaping the economic benefits.
Because Spain failed to find a significant Russian military presence in 1779, and because they were financially drained by supporting the American Revolutionary War against Britain.
Which is a fascinating geopolitical side note, Spain funding the Americans to hurt the British.
Right. They paused their northern expeditions. They think the coast is secure enough for the moment.
But the vacuum they left by pulling their ships back was instantly filled by swarms of British and American merchant ships hunting for sea otter pelts.
By 1788, the threat to Spanish sovereignty can no longer be ignored, setting the stage for a dramatic international collision.
The Spanish crown finally recognized that relying on paper claims, buried bottles, and secret maps was failing entirely. The British and Americans were actively trading in territories Spain claimed as its exclusive domain.
So what do?
In 1788, the viceroy in Mexico sent Esteban José Martínez and Gonzalo López de Haro north. Their objectives shifted from mere exploration to direct intelligence gathering.
They sailed to the Aleutian Islands and actually established direct contact with a Russian commander named Evstrat Delarov.
This meeting is a brilliant piece of historical drama. Delarov plays a masterful hand of psychological warfare against the Spanish officers.
How so?
He realizes the Spanish are anxious about Russian expansion, so he feeds that anxiety. He exaggerates the Russian presence, explicitly warning Martinez that heavily armed Russian fleets are already en route from Kamchatka to occupy Nootka Sound permanently.
Delarov's intelligence was heavily inflated, a deliberate bluff designed to keep the Spanish off balance and perhaps secure better trading terms for his own outposts.
But it worked flawlessly. When Martinez reported this impending Russian invasion back to the viceroy in Mexico, it caused sheer panic.
The viceroy responded by ordering Martinez to immediately return north and preemptively occupy Nootka Sound before the Russians arrived.
We need to explain why Nootka Sound is the focal point here. Why are the Spanish, the Russians, and the British all converging on this specific inlet on the western coast of Vancouver Island?
Well, Nootka Sound possessed a deep, sheltered harbor, which was essential for repairing ships after the brutal Pacific crossings.
More importantly, it had become the central node, the primary maritime hub for the emerging trans-Pacific fur trade.
The ships would arrive at Nootka, trade with the Nuu-chah-nulth for sea otter pelts, sail to Canton in China to sell the pelts at an immense profit, purchase tea and silk, and return to Europe or America.
So controlling Nootka Sound meant controlling the economic gateway to the entire Pacific Northwest.
So, in 1789, Martinez sails his warships into Nootka Sound. He establishes Fort San Miguel in the adjacent settlement of Santa Cruz de Nootka.
This marks the first formal European colony in what is today British Columbia.
And here is a striking detail pulled from the sources. To build this Spanish fort, they actually use a Chinese workforce. How on earth did Chinese laborers end up building a Spanish fort on Vancouver Island in 1789.
The presence of the Chinese workforce perfectly illustrates the inherently globalized nature of this conflict. Those workers had not been brought by the Spanish.
Oh, who brought them?
They had been transported across the Pacific from China by a British fur trader named Captain James Colnett. Colnett intended to use them to establish a permanent British trading post at Nootka.
When Martinez arrived to assert Spanish sovereignty, he found Nootka Sound already crowded with American and British merchant ships operating entirely outside of Spanish legal frameworks.
Essentially squatting in Spanish territory.
Put yourself in Martinez's shoes. He has orders to defend the territory from a supposed Russian fleet, but instead he finds a thriving multinational capitalist enterprise operating in his harbor.
He decides he needs to act as the sheriff of this contested gold rush town.
That's a great way to put it. He begins seizing the British merchantmen. First, he captures a ship called the Iphigenia. Then he seizes the Northwest America, which he promptly renames the Santa Gertrudis La Magna.
Finally, he seizes Colnett's ship, the Argonaut, and takes Colnett himself prisoner.
Martinez's actions were aggressive, heavy-handed, and legally precarious.
He justified the seizures by citing Spain's exclusive territorial and navigation rights derived from the papal bulls in earlier explorations.
From the rigid Spanish perspective, these British ships were heavily armed smugglers, violating sovereign waters and stealing Spanish resources.
From the British perspective, however, they were engaged in free commerce in an unoccupied territory.
The situation on the ground spirals completely out of control, and it wasn't just a conflict between European powers.
No, the local indigenous people, the Nuu-chah-nulth, who actually owned and controlled the territory, were caught in the crossfire.
The sources detail a chaotic and deeply tragic interaction. Callicum, a high-ranking noble and the brother of the powerful Chief Maquina, comes out to meet with Martinez.
There is a misunderstanding, a heated exchange of insults, an angry confrontation, and Callicum is shot dead by Spanish sailors right there in the harbor.
The killing of Callicum was a diplomatic disaster of the highest order.
It completely fractured the relationship between the Spanish garrison and the Nuu-chah-nulth leadership. Chief Maquina, witnessing the erratic and lethal behavior of the Spanish, feared for the safety of his people.
He ordered the complete abandonment of their primary summer village at Friendly Cove,
retreating deep into the protective geography of Clayoquot Sound to avoid further violence.
Spain had forcefully secured the harbor, but in doing so, they completely alienated the very people who controlled the local economy and food supply.
What started as a local dispute over a remote fur-trading anchorage instantly escalates into a global crisis. Martinez takes the captured British crews, including Captain Colnett, as prisoners and ships them back to San Blas in Mexico.
When news of these seizures and the imprisonment of British subjects finally reaches Europe, it threatens to plunge the entire continent into a large-scale war. This becomes known as the Nootka Crisis.
The transmission of this news to London in early 1790 acted as a geopolitical accelerant. The British Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, seized upon the incident.
He viewed it not just as an insult to the British flag, but as a strategic opportunity to finally break Spain's theoretical monopoly over the Pacific.
He demanded full restitution for the seized ships and formal recognition of British trading rights. To back his demands, Pitt mobilized the Royal Navy, demonstrating a clear willingness to go to war over an anchorage halfway across the globe.
Spain is backed into a corner. The chief minister, José Monino, knows full well that the Spanish fleet cannot fight the British Royal Navy alone.
They need help. So Spain turns to their traditional Bourbon ally, France.
They invoke the Family Compact, a long-standing military alliance between the Bourbon monarchs of both nations, fully expecting the French fleet to sail out and join them against the British.
But the timing could not have been worse for the Spanish crown. The year is 1790. The French Revolution is actively underway.
So the French monarchy isn't exactly in a position to help.
Not at all. By the summer, the newly formed French National Assembly is rapidly dismantling the absolute power of King Louis XVI.
When the Spanish request for military aid reaches Paris, the Assembly explicitly debates the nature of the alliance.
They declare that the new French state will not spill the blood of its citizens to defend the outdated monopolistic imperial claims of the Spanish king. France refuses to honor the compact.
Left completely isolated against the combined naval forces of Britain and the Dutch Republic, who allied with the British, Spain is forced to back down.
Right.
They cannot risk a war they are guaranteed to lose.
They have to negotiate. This complex geopolitical standoff leads to the summer 1792 negotiations right back where the trouble started, on the shores of Nootka Sound.
The diplomatic envoy sent by Spain to resolve the territorial boundaries is Bodega y Quadra, the exact same man who had pushed the tiny Sonora up to Alaska years earlier.
The British send Captain George Vancouver. The contrast between the rugged remote setting and the extreme formality of the diplomacy is striking.
They're sitting in a wooden fort on the edge of the known European world, surrounded by dense, temperate rainforest, yet Bodega y Quadra hosts grand, multi-course feasts for Vancouver.
Serving the meals on a personal collection of over 300 pieces of sterling silver dinnerware.
It is an incredible image. They're sharing these opulent silver service meals in the middle of the wilderness, being perfectly polite to one another, but they reach an absolute impasse on the boundary.
Vancouver, instructed by Pitt, essentially wants everything down to San Francisco. Bodega y Quadra, fiercely defending Spanish pride, tries to hold the line at the Strait of Juan de Fuca, offering only Nootka Sound to the British.
They argue politely for weeks, fail to reach an agreement, and decide to send the problem back to the politicians in Europe.
There's a fun fact from the sources here. Because of their mutual respect during these failed negotiations, for a while, the large landmass we now know as Vancouver Island was jointly named Vancouver's and Quadra's Island on the official maps.
Beyond the local territorial dispute and the naming of islands, the Nootka Conventions resulted in a profound, systemic evolution of international law. The agreements effectively dismantled the centuries-old framework of claiming territory by papal decree or the mere right of first discovery.
Right. Let's use an analogy here to make sure this shift is clear. Before the Nootka Conventions, international law was like walking past an empty lot in a neighborhood, pointing at it and saying, "I saw it first, it belongs to me."
And the Pope agreed.
Yes. After the Nootka Conventions, pointing wasn't enough. You actually had to pour a foundation, build a house on the lot, and live in it to claim ownership.
That is a precise summation. The Nootka Conventions firmly established the principle of effective occupation in international law.
Nations had to physically settle, garrison, and actively administer a territory to claim legal sovereignty over it. Spain's forced renunciation of its exclusive monopoly opened the Pacific to global commerce.
It was the crucial turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for the Spanish Empire's dominance in the Americas.
While the politicians in London and Madrid were arguing over these borders and rewriting international law, Spain was simultaneously funding one of the most ambitious scientific endeavors of the Enlightenment era.
They realized that knowledge, not just wooden forts or buried bottles, was a potent form of imperial power.
This brings us to the Malaspina expedition, which operated from 1789 to 1794. Commanded by Alejandro Malaspina and José de Bustamante.
This was not a hastily organized reconnaissance mission or a crude military patrol. It was a 5-year global maritime scientific exploration, heavily equipped with the elite astronomers, cartographers, botanists, and artists of the Spanish Navy.
They sailed on 2 custom-built corvettes, the Descubierta and the Atrevida. The scientific rigor applied during this voyage was unmatched.
The sources indicate that the volume and precision of the data they collected surpassed even that of James Cook's famous expeditions.
They didn't just map coastlines. They conducted extensive, respectful ethnographies of the Tlingit people in Alaska and the Nuu-chah-nulth on Vancouver Island.
And crucially, Malaspina managed to repair the fractured diplomatic relations with Chief Moquina that Martinez had destroyed.
Malaspina possessed a deep understanding of indigenous diplomacy. He did not act like an arrogant conqueror. Through careful negotiation, adherence to local protocols, and generous, respectful trade, he secured Moquina's trust.
Moquina formally agreed that the Spanish had acquired the land at Nootka Sound legally and properly.
This indigenous concession was vital for Spain's legal standing during the ongoing Nootka Convention negotiations in Europe, proving they had local consent for their presence.
But I want to focus on what might be the most staggering achievement of the Malaspina expedition, which was medical.
The scurvy issue.
Yes, we discussed earlier how scurvy completely decimated the 1775 and 1779 voyages, forcing ships to turn back and leaving crews crippled.
Malaspina's chief medical officer, Pedro Gonzalez, implemented a strict dietary regimen utilizing fresh oranges and lemons.
The result is almost unbelievable. They experienced virtually 0 scurvy outbreaks during a 62-month global voyage.
It was a monumental triumph of maritime medicine. Now, the theoretical efficacy of citrus against scurvy had been known or suspected by various mariners for decades.
Like the Scottish physician James Lind, right?
Right, he had published his findings on citrus earlier in the century. However, successfully preserving and administering fresh citrus over a continuous 5-year period in varied climates was notoriously difficult.
If they didn't have refrigeration, how did they pull that off when the British Navy was still struggling with the disease?
The key was Spain's vast pre-existing network of colonial ports. Because the Spanish Empire spanned the globe, Malaspina's ships could regularly dock at established ports in South America, Mexico, and the Philippines to resupply with fresh, locally grown fruit.
This logistical advantage ensured the health and operational efficiency of the crew in a way that the British, who relied on longer sea routes without as many friendly way stations at the time, struggled to replicate. Okay, so if this expedition was so incredibly successful, they are mapping glaciers with pinpoint accuracy, they are repairing critical diplomatic relations, they are essentially eradicating scurvy on their ships. Why isn't Alejandro Malaspina a household name today alongside Cook or Vancouver?
The tragic answer lies entirely within the toxic internal politics of the Spanish court. When Malaspina returned to Spain in 1794, he did not just bring back immaculate maps, botanical samples, and ethnographic drawings.
What else did he bring back?
He brought back detailed critical observations on the political and economic state of the Spanish Empire. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals, he suggested systemic reforms.
He argued for a more equitable administrative structure for the colonies, suggesting they be treated more like partner states rather than mere resources to be extracted.
Right, he essentially tells the absolute monarch that maybe they should share some power and treat the colonies better.
Which probably didn't go over well.
No, and furthermore, he became involved in a political conspiracy, associating with factions attempting to overthrow the deeply unpopular Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. Godoy discovered the plot and retaliated with the full force of the state.
So the Spanish crown thanks Malaspina for his 5 years of brilliant, flawless service by throwing him in a dungeon.
He was summarily stripped of his rank and imprisoned for sedition. But the tragedy extends beyond the man himself. As a consequence of his imprisonment, the state actively suppressed the publication of his expedition's findings.
The vast archives of highly accurate maps, the ethnographic journals, the biological data, the artwork, all of it was confiscated and locked away in the Royal Archives for nearly a century.
It is a profound tragedy of knowledge. Malaspina's erasure allowed other, less comprehensive voyages by British and American explorers to define the final boundaries and publish the maps of the Pacific Northwest.
Because Malaspina was silenced by his own government, the final ways of Spanish exploration are the ones that left the lingering, visible footprints on the modern map we use today.
Even as their imperial grip loosened and the Nootka Conventions eroded their exclusive claims, Spanish navigators continued to chart the intricate, dangerous waterways of the region with remarkable skill.
In 1792, Dionisio Alcala Galiano and Cayetano Valdez successfully circumnavigated Vancouver Island, proving it was not part of the mainland.
Salvador Fidalgo performed bold acts of sovereignty deep in Alaska in 1790.
And Manuel Quimper meticulously explored the depths of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, charting harbors that would eventually become major modern cities.
And you can read the landscape today and see this linguistic map they left behind. If you look at a map of the Pacific Northwest, you see the San Juan Islands, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Quadra Island, Fidalgo Island.
You have the town of Cordova in Alaska, Port Angeles in Washington state. These names are the enduring echoes of that desperate 30-year mapping effort.
The influence also extended far beyond coastal cartography. As Spanish and Mexican influence moved eastward from the coastal settlements of California into the interior plateaus, they brought their agricultural and ranching practices.
The Mexican vaqueros, the highly skilled horsemen and cattle herders, played a central, foundational role in the development of the ranching culture in the Pacific Northwest region.
The cultural linguistic exchange is still present. Even the English word buckaroo, used to describe a cowboy, is a direct linguistic descendant, an anglicized corruption of the Spanish word vaquero.
But the era of Spanish claims officially comes to a close with the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. Spain, financially exhausted and facing independence movements across South America, officially cedes all its Pacific Northwest territorial claims to the newly formed United States.
The Paper Empire, built on a papal decree from 1493, finally folds.
If we step back and look at the entire arc of this history, it leaves us with a profound reflection on how historical memory is forged and maintained.
The narrative of history is not necessarily written by the people who arrive first. It is not even written by those who gather the most rigorous, accurate scientific data as Malaspina did.
Geography and history are ultimately shaped by those who publish their findings.
Spain's institutional penchant for state secrecy, their reliance on an outdated model of imperial monopoly, combined with destructive internal political purges like the imprisonment of Malaspina, meant that their immense, dangerous, and scientifically rigorous efforts essentially vanished from the global consciousness for decades.
By hoarding their knowledge in dark vaults, by choosing secrecy over science, they allowed their imperial rivals to simply paint over the map and claim the glory.
It is a striking lesson in the power of information.
It brings us right back to those ancient maps we talked about at the beginning. The blank spaces and the sea monsters weren't replaced by the person who physically suffered through the scurvy to sail through them. First, they were replaced by the person who brought the printing press. It makes you wonder, as we look at the pace of science today, what modern discoveries are currently locked in a corporate or government vault, waiting for someone else to publish them and claim the credit.
That is a very compelling thought to end on.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.